Hi, Jay.
Hi, Matt. I just biked to work, so I'm a little sweaty.
Oh, are you? Oh, no, we've been running around all over the place. Joining us today from Stanford University is Professor Jay Bhattacharya. Jay is a professor of medicine who's long argued against universal lockdowns as a response to a pandemic. Along with Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff, he's one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which calls for an emphasis on focused protection. Great Barrington's proved controversial, with reactions ranging from the sympathetic to the hostile, and even the hysterical. Prof. Bhattacharya experienced this firsthand last week, a subject we'll be returning to very shortly. But it's fair to say that many, including our own former Health Secretary Matt Hancock, criticised the Barrington model. Hancock said the segregation of the old and vulnerable was simply not possible, and also questioned whether herd immunity was an achievable goal. However, others firmly believe it's the right approach, and the data available now is already beginning to prove this. One thing not in doubt is the reaction it's provoked, and continues to provoke. So welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the time to talk about what's happened and where we go from here. I think we can return to Great Barrington and what it stands for slightly later, but I wonder if we could start with your own experience in the last couple of weeks on campus. I believe it was fairly hostile. What did you go through?
So, I've been a professor at Stanford for 20 years, and I was a student here for actually. So I've been here mostly for 35 years. The atmosphere of academic discourse at Stanford in the last year and a half has been extraordinarily closed to open debate and discussion. It has pained me to see this. In the last couple of weeks, what happened was there was a petition written by a member of the epidemiology faculty. Now, just a little bit of background on this. I have been an unofficial advisor to Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, basically almost throughout the epidemics, certainly since the late summer of last year. And one of the issues that came up recently is the issue of whether children should be forced to wear a mask and whether parents should have the right to opt out from their children wearing a mask. The idea is that the school district can require a mask, but the parent has the right to say, well, my child is not right for my child to wear a mask because, they can give their reasons. And so Governor DeSantis put that policy in place, and there was a lawsuit by some of the school districts against Governor DeSantis. And I testified as an expert in one of those lawsuits. It is a fact that there are no randomized studies that demonstrate that masking children slows disease spread. That's just a fact, an inconvenient fact for many people who argue for masking children, but there are no high quality randomized studies. And in the context of the flu, for instance, there's 14 randomized studies in different contexts that find very little effect of masking. Again, no evaluations for children. And for adults in COVID, there's 2 randomized studies. One that finds no effect of masking people themselves is this Danish mask study, and then this Bangladesh study, which find a small effect of surgical masks in older adults. So that's the backdrop of this petition that was circulated. It accused me of did not name me directly, but it quoted me saying in court, and I think maybe even in one of these public roundtables held with Governor DeSantis, that there's no high quality evidence, including randomized trials about children masking. And then it said that this is a dangerous opinion for a Stanford professor to hold. It's contrary to Stanford's policy for masking, and it asked the president of the university to essentially censor me, to make a statement essentially saying this is not right for Stanford. There's a limit to what Stanford professors should be allowed to say, in effect. And then this petition was circulated among the epidemiology faculty with a proviso that said, don't release it for social media, don't tell anybody. This is in effect a secret petition. A friend of mine essentially leaked it to me, so I got to know of it. And I won't say which friend, but I still have some apparently. At the same time on campus, there was a campaign to put posters all over kiosks on campus with a picture of me, my face, tweeted by Governor DeSantis with a quote that said, by vaccinating the old, we protect the vulnerable, or something to that effect. And then it had a picture of Florida COVID deaths or something. Now, Florida COVID deaths, Florida is one of the oldest states in the country. And so you'd expect high deaths there. But once you adjust for that fact, Florida COVID deaths are actually in the top half of, like the top 40% of the country, and actually better than California, which has been locked down with masks and whatnot. Florida's followed a much more open Sweden-like policy, focused protection.
Sure.
And they put it all over campus. I was actually, for a few days, scared to walk on campus because it seemed to me like at least targeted harassment or potentially even a call to violence. Implicit. But so I called the campus police and told them. I complained to my department chair. Basically, no action was taken. At some point, I just decided I'm not going to be intimidated. I have a right to be on campus. I'm a professor, full professor here. So I came to campus. Carl Hennigan at Oxford and Martin Kulldorff at
Harvard.
At Harvard, when they learned of this petition, wrote a very nice piece defending the science, the science is not complicated. There isn't any on masking children that's high quality. There are no randomized trials at all. And it's 19 months in the epidemic. We've been masking children forever. Why is there no randomized evidence? There's just no good excuse. Like if we want an answer, we would have had it by now. Certainly no evidence that letting parents opt out of masking children as young as 2 does any harm. So that's what happened. We sort of shined a light on it. The petition actually, right after the article that Carl and Martin wrote, got taken down, and I've heard nothing of it since. And I'm going to keep coming to campus.
Of course. And it seems an extraordinary reaction. Is it the first time you've been accused of having dangerous opinions in your professional life?
In an underhanded way, right? Every opinion in the midst of a pandemic about the policy is dangerous one way or the other. Mm. If I'm right, I'm dangerous. If the other side is wrong, if I'm right, they're dangerous, and if they're right, I'm dangerous. We have to have a debate in the midst of uncertainty about what the right thing to do is, and every decision is fraught. And the only question in my mind, and no one's omnipotent. We're not going to be able to say one way or the other until we have an open discussion and hash it out and look at the evidence and data. The only question in my mind is, can that open discussion happen when you have a situation like this where the wrong policy kills? It just does. And my view is that the policy, the lockdown policy we have followed, has killed many, many people unnecessarily, has harmed many, many people unnecessarily. I think that the orthodoxy is dangerous. So the question isn't one of dangerousness of opinion. The question is correctness of policy.
Mm-hmm. And I think with masks, it's an interesting one. It's obviously caused an awful lot of debate over this side of the Atlantic also. And the question of evidence comes up time and again. A study is presented, another study is presented by the other side, but there seems to have been very little agreement.
Well, this is what happens when you have a lot of low quality evidence in a difficult area. You have like conflicting studies, and they're all like correlation studies or these like physics studies about how much droplets or aerosol. It's all of that is not the relevant. That's helpful. It helps you figure out hypotheses. But in medical settings, when you're putting essentially a medical intervention, which is masking of young children, you have to have randomized evidence, especially when you deploy it at population scale. Now, you can understand early in the epidemic, there isn't any, and we sort of tilt toward, it seems like asking a 2-year-old to mask is not so bad, I guess. I'm not sure that's true, but I guess that was what people thought. But 19 months in, there's no good reason not to have a randomized study. That's how you resolve disputes like this when there's so much conflicting low quality evidence floating around.
Sure. And were you surprised by the reaction when you saw it?
Mass it's a weird thing, right, Matt? Like there's been like this almost emotional attachment to mass on actually, frankly, on both sides. Like one side says, let me be free, and the other side says, if you don't mask, you're a monster. And I think I knew I was sort of stepping on a third rail when I said that, but I don't know, what am I supposed to do? I'm a professor that reads evidence and for a living and is asked to comment on it. So I just had to do my job.
Of course. And I think we'll return back to a reaction slightly later on. But I think just quickly, just for listeners who may not know, could we just have a quick look at Great Barrington itself? And perhaps you give us a brief synopsis of what Great Barrington called for and what it is for those who may not know?
Sure. So the Great Barrington Declaration was was signed by me, Professor Kuhldorff at Harvard, and then Professor Sunetra Gupta at University of Oxford at Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where we met in October of last year. The idea was premised on two basic scientific facts, and I can go over them very, very simply because they're so obvious and everyone knows them. One is that this disease is most harmful to the elderly, to the old. There's a 1,000-fold difference between the risk this disease poses to the old versus what it poses to the young. For the old, it's the data from around the world from various studies suggest that if you're infected, the survival rate is something like 95, 94, 93%. It could be 92. It depends on the age. Of 70 and up, that's a high mortality rate. I mean, that is a very high mortality rate for a single disease if you get it. On the other hand, for young people, it's much, much, much less. 3 orders of magnitude less. So for children, for instance, this disease is less dangerous than the flu. More children died last year from the flu and in typical flu seasons than died from COVID in the United States, for instance. There's a lot of propaganda around this, but that's just a basic fact. If you look at the data, it comes out. And so the disease is really deadly for a particular segment of the population, much, much less deadly for younger people. And then the second premise, and this is, I think, utterly undisputed, although many people in the scientific community want to ignore it, the lockdowns are tremendously harmful to public health, tremendously harmful to the health of the population. I know in the UK, you've had these enormous backlogs of people waiting to get their cancer screening or their diabetes management. The same thing similar things happen everywhere that lockdowns have been implemented. It is what has happened during these lockdowns is taking the vision of public health, which is supposed to be holistic, for worried about and caring for the entire health of the population, and instead focused on a single infectious disease at the expense of all the other things that may harm people, including, as I said, cancer screening, diabetes management, mental health. 1 in 4 young adults last year in the United States seriously considered suicide. And the mental health consequences in the UK have been similarly bad. For children, it's been devastating. Like for many places in the United States, children did not have in-person schooling for almost a full year and a half. And so and especially for poor and working class people, these lockdowns have been really devastating. So you put those two facts together. The disease is very deadly for a particular segment of the population and much less deadly for another. The lockdowns harm that other. So what the Great Barrington Declaration calls for is focused protection of the older population, not, as Matt Hancock said, segregation of the old and young. That's nonsense. Public health can work to protect the vulnerable without having to segregate, per se. Segregation may be a part of for temporary times for some people when in times of great danger, that may be, but it's not the primary tool. And then for the younger population, lift the lockdowns, and because the lockdowns are causing on net harm to the health of the population.
I think one of the criticisms was actually about, you've just challenged the word segregation, but protection of the elderly and vulnerable. The argument was that it simply couldn't be done, that this was a virus that would find them in one way or another. And on that basis, it was impossible. Presumably that's something you would disagree with.
Yeah, so I think first let's talk about the alternate view. The alternate view is not automatic protection of the vulnerable. In fact, the vulnerable have suffered and died at great numbers in places that the lockdowns have implemented. The premise was that somehow the lockdowns would protect the old, and they have not protected the old. Right? The winter wave in the UK, the US, all over the world, wherever lockdowns were tried, did not protect the old. We have the empirical evidence very clear that premise failed. And in fact, I think that premise was harmful because I think normally public health actually does do something like focus protection for everything, right? It seeks to find ways to tailor the response to the resources and bring resources and knowledge to bear so that the people that are most at threat can have the resources to get protected, and not just in COVID, but for many, many other things. Public health that I know is creative about this. So for instance, there were some things many places tried. Not in the early days of the epidemic, we sent COVID-infected patients into nursing homes, literally negative focus protection. Stopping doing that was a form of focus protection. right? People living in multi-generational homes, older people living with young people together in a single home. I mean, that's the danger, right? How do you protect them? Well, we've had these many young people with fancy jobs ordered food online, asking older workers to come and deliver the food to them to take the risk. You could have had a program that delivers food to older people living alone. For people living in multi-generational homes, if the young person comes on and says, "Oh, grandma, I think I might have been exposed," then you offer a temporary hotel room for the grandma if she wants it. Mm-hmm. We spent trillions of dollars in the United States and the UK spent incredible amount of money. If the money had been spent to creatively work to protect older populations, we would have many fewer deaths. Instead, we relied on the lockdowns to protect them, and that failed. There's another aspect to this. As soon as the vaccines came available, you know what governments around the world did? They actually adopted something like the Great Barrington Declaration. They prioritized the vaccine for the older, because you no longer have an argument, right, that you can't protect the old. You now have a vaccine that's quite good at protecting people against severe disease and death, and so the governments around the world used it. On many did. Some failed at this, but like many used it by prioritizing the old, and that saved many lives.
I was actually going to suggest that the vaccines, in a way, were Great Barrington in action to a degree, in the sense that they did provide this focused protection. I suppose it does lead to a question, though: could Great Barrington have ever worked without the vaccines?
Well, I think the answer is yes, but it would have been much more difficult and challenging. It would have required creativity. It would have been harder. The vaccines are an incredible technology, and thank God that they came along. I mean, they as I said, greatly reduced the morbidity and mortality from this disease when deployed correctly. I think in the UK, and for instance, this most recent wave, you had a very large number of cases, but many fewer deaths than you would have expected, in large part because of the success in vaccinating the old. And same thing in Sweden, many other places that have had successful vaccination campaigns that prioritize the old have had this sort of decoupling of cases and deaths. Mm-hmm. So I think that's quite important. I mean, that's the fruits of focused protection. That's what focused protection looks like. It doesn't stop cases from spreading. We have no technology that can do that, other than herd immunity, by the way. So we can talk about what that means, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that as well. But what it does do is it reduces the morbidity and mortality from those cases, so that we no longer have to fear the disease as much as we once did.
It brings me on to herd immunity, in fact, because that's probably the other more sensible plank of the criticism, I would suggest, which is recently argued. Sir Andrew Pollard, who's head of the Oxford Vaccines Group, said herd immunity was now a mythical notion, in part, I think, because of the variants, because of Delta, but it simply wasn't achievable. Is that something you'd agree with, or is that not?
That's nonsense. So I think a lot of this stems from a misunderstanding what herd immunity means. I think in the public mind, and maybe even in some scientists' mind, herd immunity is a synonym for zero COVID, that the disease is gone. In fact, that's not what herd immunity means. Herd immunity is technically what it means is that you're in a state where one additional person getting the disease infects one or fewer additional people. So the disease is not growing. So in effect, whenever the incidence rate of the disease is coming down, you're in some sort of herd immunity. The herd immunity threshold varies with season and varies across regions. Very clearly, this virus is more amenable to spread in some times of the year than others. I mean, it's not an accident that there's so many of the northern parts of the world had rises in cases together in the winter, and many of the southern hemisphere had rises in case in their winter. Our summer. The Australian surge of cases is not, again, an accident. They're going through essentially their winter, right? Or almost their winter's over now. So the herd immunity threshold depends on a lot of things. When cases are above the herd immunity threshold, what that means is that there's a sufficiently large fraction of the population that when someone interacts with them, another random person, they're not going to spread the disease. That person has some resistance to the disease. That's just a reality. If you're infected, you're recovered from this disease, it induces long-lasting immunity. There's a study that was just published in the Journal of American Medical Association found that after a year, I think is a study. I'm trying to remember the country, but it might have been. I think it was Qatar. I might be wrong. It was Qatar, I think. At 1 year, it was 0.3% of people who were infected and recovered had reinfection.
Yeah,
0.3%, 3 out of 1,000, and only one person was hospitalized in the reinfection. A disease that induces that kind of long-lasting immunity, even shorter-lasting immunity than that, will have herd immunity. That doesn't mean the disease is gone. The disease is here forever. It's endemic. It will spread. It now has joined one of the 200 other diseases that we humans face. 200 some diseases that we humans face. So we have to learn to stop fearing the disease, and understand that. But we have great tools now to protect ourselves from it. The vaccines are one, but also therapeutics like the monoclonal antibodies and others that actually allow you to treat the disease and reduce the morbidity from it if you get infected. So I think the idea that herd immunity is impossible, I think it's just a category. It's a mistake. It's a scientific mistake. It's a misunderstanding what it means. Herd immunity does not mean the disease is gone. Herd immunity just means you're in a situation where the disease is becoming less prevalent. It will become more prevalent. That we're going to have ups and downs with the disease. This disease is here forever, right?
Yeah.
Just so you go in and out of herd immunity.
Of course. And so would you say from an epidemiological perspective, is there anything unusual in the steps that Barrington recommended? Or would you say this is standard classical epidemiology?
It's you caught me here because it's the old plan. There's nothing really new in it. It is the old standard plan that we've used to cope with epidemics for a century.
Sure.
Going back most recently to 2009, the H1N1, the 1956, 1968, 1976, we worked to protect the vulnerable as we could, and disrupted society as little as possible because the harms from that disruption were so great. That was the standard way of coping with epidemics for a century, and it worked. Mm-hmm. What we're doing now is an extraordinary experiment at population scale with no informed consent.
Just moving on, thanks so much for explaining Barrington to us. I think it's been fair to say some of the reaction to it has been extraordinary. I've detailed some of the perhaps more logical questions that people might feel inspired to ask when approaching it. But there has been some far more outlandish and eccentric claims, and I wonder if I could just run through a couple with you, and perhaps if you could just say true, false, what you make of it. And so to start with a couple was that Barrington is funded by the AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research. It's a right-wing think tank in America. Is that true? Does Great Barrington receive funding from the AIER?
No, that's false. 100% categorically false. None of the three of us, the primary authors, have received any money at all from AIER for our work on the Great Barrington Declaration at all. And none of us have been employed by AIER. We've done no consulting for AIER. We've received no money from AIER at all. AIER is a free market think tank. I don't think they characterize themselves as right wing, but you can ask them. But the key thing is that is categorically untrue.
Okay. The second one, linked very closely to the first one, is that if the AIRE funding is somehow right, that connects the Great Barrington Declaration for Koch brothers to very wealthy industrialists in America, often linked fairly or unfairly to the right. Do you know Charles or David Koch? Have you met them? Are you funded by them?
I personally received absolutely no money ever from the Koch brothers. I don't, whether you received it or not, that's essentially it's like a guilt by association attack. Mm-hmm. In effect, it's illogical. It's the kind of argument people use when they don't have better arguments, in effect. I view such attacks as actually a confession of weakness by the other side. I have never received any money from the Koch brothers. From what I understand, the AIER is not funded, or I think they had one conference that was funded by the Koch brothers, but they're not affiliated with the Koch brothers. I'm not affiliated with the AIER. I don't understand this attack other than as a sign of weakness, because it's essentially like trying to, I once went to Disneyland. Does that mean I am in favor of the greed of Scrooge McDuck? That's the kind of logic this argument makes.
Of course.
I've been to Disneyland many times.
Well, there we have it. Do you have any allegiance at all to the alt-right?
First of all, I have no idea what that is. I'm not affiliated with any political party. I've never registered for a political party. As a health economist, I've viewed it as my job to be able to talk to everybody. Essentially, that should be the job of public health. And I'm not. I have an MD and a PhD in economics. I like markets, so I've always thought of that as somewhat center right. What I've come to realize is that that's not actually an accurate depiction. I actually, frankly, have no idea what my politics are now. My closest allies at this point are actually, frankly, on the left. So there's some of the allies I have on the right as well. I think the COVID era has sort of reshuffled many of these traditional connections between tribal affiliations. A lot of the dysfunction has been this sort of weird tribal affiliation to labels like right or left. I honestly don't know what that means. I think, to me personally, what ties together the anti-lockdown movement is an observation that the lockdowns have harmed the poor and the vulnerable. That is if I'd have to characterize my politics, that's the center of what I've done my entire life, is work to understand the constraints that the poor and vulnerable face, and work to address those constraints so that they can have good health and flourishing lives. That's been the center of my research for 20 some years. Is that left or right? I honestly don't know.
Of course. And forgive me if I just ask you two more just to get them done. These are actually claims which have been published and again, I may come back to that shortly, but Barrington is somehow connected to climate change denial.
That's such an odd thing. We don't make any statement one way or the other, but it's entirely orthogonal to anything to do with climate change, one way or the other. It's again, it's an attempt to do a guilt by association attack because the arguments on the other side are so weak. The answer is no. It is not connected in any way whatsoever to climate change denial.
And I think I may know your answer to this next one, that GBD is connected to or funded by the British Military of Defence.
Where's the money? I've taken. Let me put in a broader thing. I have taken no personal money outside of my own salary for any of my COVID work during the epidemic. I've done, I think, 30 or 40 expert witness testimonies in trials. I've testified at countless places. I've given speeches where honoraria were offered to me. I've turned all of it down. I don't believe that it's right for me to profit off of my work for COVID. It is not funded. I'm not funded by the British Ministry of Health. I don't think anyone I know of, Sinetra is not, Martin is not. I think that is an absolute nonsense conspiracy theory kind of attack.
Of course. So would you say Great Barrington is an honestly held scientific opinion, untainted by external pressures?
Well, the listeners can judge. I honestly hold it. I believe very strong. I wrote it. My life would have been easier if I didn't write it. I wrote it because I have very grave concerns about the path that many governments have followed with these lockdowns. I think the lockdowns, I already look at them as the single biggest public health mistake in history, in the extent of harm that they've done in many, many dimensions. I don't think that's going to be a controversial opinion in just a short while.
I was going to say Barrington was actually signed in October last year. Since then, we've had an awful lot of data. We're almost a year on. Do you feel the data's pointed in the direction of you being right since then?
I believe so. I think the lockdowns themselves have not succeeded. The promises that were made by the lockdowners to that it would help us get rid of. Some of them actually believe they would get the disease down to zero. Mm-hmm. That's absolute nonsense, and that somehow we just haven't locked down hard enough. Well, Australia gives lie to that. They locked down quite hard, and still not zero, because this disease we have no technology to stop this disease from circulating in the human population. None. Lockdowns don't work. The vaccines don't work. Nothing we have will stop the disease from spreading. The only question is protection of the vulnerable. So in that sense, the lockdowns have failed. Has the alternative worked? There's been only a few places that sort of adopted something close to the Great Barrington Declaration. Sweden, probably the most prominent example, although they didn't call it that. They had early in the pandemic, they had some failures in their nursing homes. There's a failure of focused protection, especially in Stockholm, that led to some excess deaths there, which is really unfortunate. But for the most part, they've had a voluntary approach to the thing where they told people, look, this disease is dangerous for this group. You ought to take more cover. They've worked to protect their old. And when the vaccines came, they prioritized the old, like systematically made sure that young people didn't get it until older people had gotten it. And they've had enormous success, I think. In the United States, Florida has had something like the Great Barrington Plan. Children were in school all year last year in Florida, not in California, for instance. And I think largely it's been rough up and down. The vaccine campaign was actually quite good in vaccinating the old in Florida. By the end of January of this year, the Florida had offered the vaccine to literally every single person in a care home. And by the middle of February, it offered it to almost every older person in Florida. Uptake was like 80%. Much of the deaths in the recent wave in Florida had been in the unvaccinated old, because 20% of the people turned it down. 20% of the old turned it down, which is really unfortunate. But I think protection of the old is the key to this disease. I don't think there's any dispute, no true, real scientific dispute about that. If you want to defang this disease, you have to protect the old, because this disease is the most dangerous to the older population.
Well, thank you so much for those very cogent arguments. And as I say, I felt obliged to put those claims to they have been repeated in several places. So thank you very much for that. So on the basis of that, as I say, you've argued your point now. Are you surprised there's been such hostility and such tactics in reaction to it?
I mean, I think, I've been trying to understand this, because it's been present for almost the beginning of the epidemic. And like one way to understand it is competing norms about public communication in science and public health. In science, public communication is not the central thing. The question is, do I have an idea that stands the test of experiment? And the ideas, the competing ideas, there should be absolutely no restrictions on what I can think and experiment and argue. Right? Open debate and discussion is central to the advance of science. When you in advance say, no, you can't have a theory that says evolutionary biology is right, like you had in the Soviet Union under Lysenko. Well, you're gonna have essentially frozen scientific discussion. And you kill science. So the norm in science is absolutely free and open discussion. I think you think B. We agree on an experiment that resolves between A and B. The experiment comes out on your side, and now I have to take B until I think of B prime, and then we can do it again and again and again. Right? That's the fun of science. Completely freewheeling discussion. The norm in public health is unified messaging. Right. So if I say A and you say B and the public hears it and they're confused what to do, well, we've done poorly.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, no, continue. Sorry, that was mine.
Oh yeah. But the problem here is that you don't have the moral basis for unified messaging in public health is actually scientific consensus. If you do not have scientific consensus, it is immoral to have a norm that says, well, Jay, you can't think B because the public might be scared about or they're confused because I want to say the message A. Well, B might be right. What if focused protection is the right approach? Right? That's a scientific question. And the norm applied in this discussion has been this public health norm where like for instance, of smoking, right? Smoking is bad for you. There's incredibly strong scientific evidence on that. There may be some very, very few minority people who may disagree, but they're very clearly on the fringe. It actually has some moral basis for public health to say smoking is bad for you, and people shouldn't be confusing the public by saying otherwise. Here, you don't actually have a consensus. You could see this from the signatories in the Great Barrington Declaration. We had tens of thousands of epidemiologists, scientists, and doctors, and I've gotten many, many others who've written to me saying that they were scared to speak up. Mm-hmm. Scientists, public health officials, epidemiologists scared to speak up because of the atmosphere of fear that the lockdowners have caused in the discussion. People have lost their jobs for speaking up.
How?
They've been discredited.
How widespread is that? Do you know many cases?
I don't have a clear measure, because I mean, people, again, it's much of it is self-censorship. So like, for instance, that petition that my colleagues floated around the department. If you're a junior faculty member, how do you not sign it when your department chair floats it around? What do they actually think? Doesn't matter. They're just, in effect, coerced into signing it. Right? It's an insidious way to do science. You have to have an open discussion of the scientific facts if you're going to actually claim consensus. Instead, what's happened here is a claim of consensus that does not actually exist.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, the orthodoxy itself has become dangerous. So
I think the orthodoxy is dangerous.
What does one do to challenge that orthodoxy?
Speak up. I think what we need is open discussion. That's worked forever. I mean, it's worked since the Enlightenment. Let's have that back. That actually is quite productive, right? I mean, it's messy. We're going to have fits and starts, and we're going to end up disputing with one another. But we're disputing with one another over substantive things, not nonsense, right? Not ad hominem nonsense.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier colleagues who were perhaps scared of speaking out, people you've heard of who were worried about speaking out because of the consequences on their jobs or reputations. That's a picture we've had described to us over here in the UK as well. Do you feel that's fairly widespread for the academic community at the moment?
I think it's worldwide.
Worldwide, really.
I mean, I've heard from scientists all over the world telling me the very, very similar stories. Some have literally lost their jobs. Others tell me that they support our ideas and offered me data and information, but are afraid to say it themselves. Mm-hmm. And look, I don't have any. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for people that are in that situation. Essentially, their lives and livelihoods, their life work depends on not speaking up, mm-hmm. Because of the atmosphere of repression that science is under currently. So I think I mean, I understand it's hard to speak up. I mean, I had no choice. I mean, I essentially worked in public health and health policy and infectious disease epidemiology for 20 some years. I've sort of found myself in a situation where my life's work depended on being. I mean, I have to be able to say what I see. I just need to be able to talk, and whatever the cost, I'm going to talk.
Sure. And interestingly, one thing that came up as well is it's not perhaps just fringe groups who've been unusually hostile towards you and your colleagues. Some of the attacks have come from within academia itself. Retired Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption's been a vocal critic of this abuse. He said to us recently, "Scientists behaving like the persecutions of Galileo." Were you surprised to see this coming from? I mean, often we speak about trolls, we speak about fake news, and so on. But some of this seems to be generated in and repeated by the academic community. Is that something new to you?
Yeah, I mean, there was recently some blog post on the British Medical Journal. I mean, I published in the British Medical Journal. It's a fantastic journal, a site of high repute. Although maybe I'm changing my opinion about now that this essentially repeating some of the arguments you said. It's absolute falsehood, libel. I mean, lies about funding, or I mean, essentially not a single substantive argument, just guilt by association attacks and ad hominem attacks. And the purpose is simple: expel the heretic. Right? Make it so that it's so dangerous to your career that even the British Medical Journal won't allow you to have it. They'll do a character assassination attack on it instead. It's beneath the British Medical Journal. I wish they would repudiate what they've done, apologize for it.
Well, in fact, one of the reasons I did put you through that list of questions was because the British Medical Journal was the source. That was a blog from there where most of those allegations were made. It may not be all, but several of them were made.
I mean, they're just lies. I mean, it's filled with absolute untruths, and it's designed. It's very simple. It's not really aimed at me. Mm-hmm. It's aimed at other scientists. They're saying, look, if you speak up out of line, what you actually are thinking, well, that was a nice career you have. It would be a shame if something happened to it.
Of course. And perhaps the only answer to this, you say, is that people who are perhaps unwilling to speak up now find the courage to do so, or is that too much?
Yeah, lots of people are. That's what I mean. I think people are starting to say, "Look, this is not right. Mm-hmm. This atmosphere of repression is not right." People are starting to speak up. I think as we get closer and closer to the end of the epidemic, And it becomes clearer and clearer that the policies pushed by the orthodoxy were an utter failure.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people that pushed this orthodoxy were at the top of the profession,
Mm-hmm.
and there are great egos at stake. And so there's going to be a massive fight over the history of this pandemic. It's going to be quite important for future pandemics that people speak up and say what they saw. Yeah, I mean, I think because we can't have I characterize the orthodoxy's response to this pandemic as an utter failure. I don't see how anyone can look at it and think otherwise. I'll just give you one example of how this kind of nonsense, right? So Sunetra Gupta and Carl Hennigan met with Boris Johnson alongside Neil Ferguson and many other lockdowners in October. Sunetra and Carl lost the argument. You all had a massive lockdown that lasted months. And yet somehow they're to blame.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolute nonsense. The lockdowners got their way. The policy failed. And what you're seeing now is an attempt to try to rewrite history to pretend like the lockdowners didn't get their way. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of fight is going to happen because the people that are in power within science can't abide that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the nastiness, a lot of the ad hominem, the guilt by association attacks are occurring because of that. That they are in a position where they gave advice to governments that have proved catastrophically wrong.
Do you believe it's organized in some way? Do you believe there's a central organizing force, or is it disparate groups behind this?
I mean, I think much of it is decentralized. I mean, like it's sort of a mass hysteria, but I think part of it may be organized. Like there was a book by Jeremy Farrar, the head of the Wellcome Trust, where he mentioned that he had reached out to Dominic Cummings, I guess is the conciliere of the former conciliere of Boris Johnson, where in effect it sounded like they were organizing some kind of propaganda campaign. And I think I read in the Telegraph something very similar to I mean, effectively admission by Independent. It was emails by Independent Sage accusing some of the folks who disagree with them of again an ad hominem kind of
anti-vax in that case, I believe. But,
yeah, nonsense. I mean, Sunetra Gupta, for a living, makes vaccines. Mm-hmm. She is to call her anti-vax is a absolute lie, mm-hmm. and she's also not anti-vax for this vax. So the whole thing is just it's just an attempt to get to evade responsibility for the failed policies that the orthodoxy pushed.
Mm-hmm. And looking further ahead to possible other ways of breaking this deadlock or solutions, what role do you believe politics, for example, has to play in this? Should politicians be doing more to opening up debate, to allowing both sides to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to return to the liberal social order. Right? The liberal social order permits a very, very wide range of contrary opinions to dispute with one another in fair ways. And I think that politicians play a very, very important role in that. I think in this pandemic, what happened was most politicians did not have the expertise to decide what the right policy should be. So they essentially turned it over to the orthodox scientists. Mm-hmm. They turned policy over to the orthodox scientists. The orthodox scientists, in effect, were our political rulers for the last year and a half. Mm-hmm. And the politicians abdicated, most of them abdicated the responsibility they had to the public, essentially so that the orthodox scientists had their way. I think politicians in a liberal social order have a responsibility to seek out conflicting opinions on topics they don't understand, make decisions that reflect the will of the people that put them in their power. Politics in a pandemic plays an absolutely central role, and it actually has to. Mm-hmm. Our politicians are the ones who are the avatars of the of what the people want, and they face, unlike scientists, they face electoral rebuke if they did go wrong. Scientists face no electoral rebuke, and as you can see, they work very hard to make sure that even when they're wrong, they hide it. So I think it's now you can also take the question a different way. Politics, there's a nastiness to politics in recent decade, which is I think undermined our ability to have essentially a liberal social order where fair discussion can take place between disputing people. I think politicians have played a central role in that as well. I would call for a return to a liberal social order, mm-hmm. where you can have disputing people. Disputes are normal, resolved via normal means in science, by experiment, in politics, by election, and a repudiation of the kind of tactics we've seen where you essentially expel the heretics on the other side.
Well, interestingly, we had Parliament, didn't it, for many, many months during the pandemic, where were attempts for via Zoom and so on, and you perhaps lost that debate in the chamber, and I think perhaps it was more difficult to bring an alternative view across. I think for many of them, there are some who've argued against. The opposition tends to be in favour, but it's the pandemic itself brought a certain deadlock to politics in the UK. That's certainly how I see it, and I think perhaps at a time where we needed discussion more than ever, it was shut down more than ever as a result of the pandemic it was attempting to deal with. So I suppose it's a vicious circle in a way. But just moving on to the second part of that question, which is something close to my heart, which is the media, both traditional and social media. What role do you think they've had to play in this, in the question of an orthodoxy and a hereticism, if you like, and what ought to be done to address that?
I mean, the media has, in effect, been an organ of the government almost everywhere, and the United States has been particularly pernicious. The media and social media, big tech, have worked in lockstep to censor and remove from public discussion any dissent, including to the extent where, for instance, I was on a public roundtable filmed with the Florida governor, and that video of me and Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff and Scott Atlas talking with the governor of Florida was removed from YouTube, censored off of YouTube. That is absolutely extraordinary that such a thing could happen. Because the governor of Florida essentially is showing the public of what the scientific advice he's getting openly. Agree or disagree with it, that you now see what the advice he's getting and what the basis of some of the decisions he's making. Right? He's responsible to the voters. The voters now can see what advice he's getting. And YouTube removed it so that the public couldn't see it. That is an absolutely pernicious role that YouTube has taken on itself. But I don't think it took it on itself entirely. I think partly it was egged on by the government, and again by the orthodoxy, to take that role onto itself. You have a situation where the free discussion, the norms of free discussion in society were undermined in part by much of the media and also by big tech. I don't know. I guess my sense is that there was a little more freedom in the UK on the press side, and much less negativity. Like 90% of the stories, there was a study, like 90% of the stories about COVID were deeply negative and fear-mongering in the United States, and like much lower, like 60% in Europe. The US media played a particularly bad role in this, in the fear-mongering. We're still seeing the harms of that. Like many people are scared to return to life even after they've been vaccinated.
And it's one of the interesting things we've seen here working in the media myself is the traditional roles of the papers. You maybe have the Guardian and the Mirror, who will be left-wing, the Mirror certainly Labour supporting, have not quite been flipped on their head, but in some ways they've been some of the staunchest supporters of a government policy, which Labour has also.
It's actually extraordinary. I don't really understand it. I mean, in effect, the traditional political spokesfolk, the organs that would represent the working class have abandoned the working class in this. It's a working class that were deemed essential, whether they were vulnerable or not, asked to go out in public and keep society going. And places like the Guardian essentially abandoned them.
And just quickly going back to big tech, and I think you hinted at this, and it may be that there is no simple answer. But do you have any feelings as to why Twitter, YouTube have perhaps been so strong in clamping down on anything which disagrees with orthodoxy? Is there anything that you think?
I think the government asked them to. I think the government, has in effect, told them that so in the United States, these entities essentially are not publishers. They're not seen as publishers. They're not subject to the kind of regulations like libel laws or whatnot. But the government told them during this pandemic, if you publish misinformation, we're gonna crank down on you. I mean, and they actively wanted to cooperate. Like there are emails between Dr. Tony Fauci and the head of Facebook. Very, very early in the epidemic, and it's actually interesting. Like they're talking about how to work together. So in effect, they became arms of the government.
Which at first blush can seem like a sensible and mature approach for a major publisher to take, providing the orthodoxy is the correct orthodoxy. If there's a flaw in the orthodoxy, we're in trouble.
It's actually quite extraordinary, right? So like the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, they grew up in this sort of environment where they were supposed to be opening speech up, letting more voices in. And instead, what they become is an instrument of repression.
Did you ever envisage we'd end up at this point? We'd end up having this discussion about what's happened. Could you have foreseen this when you signed Barrington? Did you think something like this might happen when the pandemic first became apparent? Did you think we might end up in this path 18 months later?
I mean, so like when I started in April, I worked on a series of seroprevalence studies. I was just a scientist. I mean, I'd never done TV. I'd never basically never written an op-ed. I was not political at all. I mean, I was just doing science. And I thought that was the norms that we would operate under, that I grew up with. This sort of perversion of these norms, this sort of repression that we've seen, I'd never imagined. When we signed Great Barrington, I knew that there was going to be pushback. I absolutely knew that because one of the major purposes of the Great Barrington, as I said, it's an old plan. There's nothing new in it, really. Was to give voice to the very large number of people I knew were uncomfortable with the lockdowns. Essentially, to give space for people to push back and speak up. And that's what happened. But I knew there would be a lot of like nastiness around that. I mean, that it was essentially like you lift up what I wanted to do is we wanted to lift up like a rotten log, and you can see the beetles scurrying around underneath. But also sunlight's coming in, right? So you have this. That's essentially how I was thinking what would happen. I knew there would be all kinds of attacks. Already by October of last year, this sort of dynamic had already taken hold. So it was an attempt to push back against this dynamic, as well as to propose a new strategy.
And given all that's happened since, do you regret signing it? Would you do the same again?
And it's the best thing I've ever done. In 100 years, I'd sign it every time.
And I think we've touched on this a fair bit, but if I could just ask you as a direct question, actually, it's clear what the dangers are about shutting down scientific discourse. I think most people would agree with that. So how do we address this apparent closing down of a debate? What steps would you like to see taken to change what's happened, to make sure it perhaps couldn't happen again?
I think science has to recommit to its better angels. The leaders of science, the universities, leaders of universities, the people who are president of grant funding organizations have to recommit to open science, to science conducted openly and fairly and honestly. The journals, I think those leaders play an enormously important role in setting the tone of what kind of scientific discussion happens. And it's actually on them that they have permitted this sort of nastiness to enter into science, this ad hominem smearing. The leaders of science need to start articulating very clearly what open scientific discussion, what fair scientific discussion, what good scientific discussion looks like. It's built on the liberal social order. It's built on free discussion between free people talking to one another, resolving disputes by experiment and reason, right? That's I think I had taken that for granted, and clearly that was a mistake. I mean, I think that the leaders of science need to, as one, speak up in favor of that.
And without wanting to name specific individuals, when you say leaders of science, are we talking about the large organizations, for large funding groups, for large international bodies? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the above. Every single one of those organs are quite important in what kind of scientific, the sort of the tenor of scientific discussion happens, the kind of environment that science happens in. Science that has this kind of repressive environment is not science; it's something else. But it's still possible to turn it around if the leaders of these, like the NIH, the leaders of the Wellcome Trust, the leaders of the universities. A lot of these are publicly funded. I think, and the public plays an important role in this. The public should demand that they do better. I think especially the university leaders could very easily sort of take a stand on this if they so chose. A large enough group of these scientific leaders articulating clearly an argument for or calling for scientific freedom. A return to scientific freedom, I think, would have an enormously important effect.
I suppose the first step of that may be admitting we may have been wrong in what we said before, which is never easy.
People don't want to admit. So, I'm okay with not admitting. I think I'm okay as far as like scientific freedom goes. They just need to adopt. They just need to wholeheartedly adopt scientific freedom. They don't have to say whether the orthodoxy is right or wrong about lockdown. That's a separate matter. They just need to recommit to the Enlightenment.
And what happens if we don't? Where do you see it going if we carry on down this path? If we carry on down a set orthodoxy at the start of something like this, which is pursued until it's no longer possible to pursue, what happens then?
I asked, I had actually had the great fortune of interviewing Lord Sumption, and I asked him that question. And his answer was that we are in for a new dark age.
Really?
I think that's avoidable. But we as a scientific community, we as a political community, have to recommit to the norms of the liberal social order that we once had.
And one final question, which I hope could end up on a cheery note, but may not, despite all the chaos. How optimistic are you in terms of this pandemic and how it may play out in the coming months and future pandemics should they arise?
I think this virus, the nasty, nasty virus, still has some surprises left in it for us. It will still wreak some harm, but we are actually, in many places, nearing the end, I believe. And I don't know exactly when, or I think a lot of the attempts to sort of predict the future have gone very badly wrong, both by many people, including folks who have been central to pushing the lockdowns. What I think is that we are approaching a time where we have to ask ourselves, how should we live with this virus? And societies are going to have to decide between one of two paths. Either a biosecurity state where the central organizing principle is suppression of a single infectious disease. Vaccine passports, entry restrictions, periodic closures of schools, mask wearing everywhere, fear of your neighbor, or essentially the liberal social order, where this unfortunate virus may still circulate, but we work to protect the vulnerable, just like we're always as we do with the 200 other pathogens, and work to develop new therapeutics, better vaccines. I think that those are the two choices: a liberal social order devoted to a holistic vision of public health and public policy, or a biosecurity state focused on the suppression of this single disease.
And are you confident of one or the other prevailing?
I'm an optimist. I think if you ask Lord Sumption, he'd say, well, he's tend to be more pessimistic, but I tend to be an optimist. I'm going to work, and I know he will work, and many of us will work toward the liberal social order. And it's, like I said, I think it transcends the old political labels. It'll be fun when the old political labels come back, because then we can actually, the politics will just be sport and nothing more, nothing more than that. Here, I think we have essentially an existential crisis about what our societies are going to look like in coming years.
That's lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and I hope it's been a useful discussion for you too. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Oh, it was a great pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for letting me express my views openly. This is how we start to do the healing.
I hope so, and we hope to speak again soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.